Hi, this is Tom Murphy, and this is another edition of the Tom Murphy Show. With me in the studio here tonight, Maggie Howell. Maggie, thank you for joining us here, and thank you for bringing Atka. That's an interesting animal. Let me just start the interview by asking, do you think it was predetermined that you were going to have this job because you were named Howell? I'm sure you've heard that a million times.
Yeah, I suppose it was meant to be, but I'm happy. You know, I'm happy. It's better than being compared to Gilligan's Island, which was
Thurston Howell the Third. Okay.
Few decades of my life. So Atka trumps Gilligan any day.
Tell us about your organization.
Sure. The Wolf Conservation Center. We're right here in Westchester. We're actually in South Salem. And we're a non-for-profit. We've been around for about 15 years. Probably the most exciting thing about the Wolf Center, though, is that we're currently home to 21 wolves.
Okay.
So not necessarily, definitely not the norm for a suburb of New York City. And what we do at the Wolf Center is we actually have a few different programs, but we're doing education, and we also have Atka visit schools, museums, and we're also doing recovery, where we have critically endangered Mexican wolves and red wolves, and we prep them for release into their ancestral homes in the wild. And we're also mobilizing support. So we're trying to get people to take action for wolves, if it's political matters or anything that's really going on in North America to help facilitate recovery.
We're all socialized through the big bad wolf and the Little Red Riding Hood. And we have all these negative connotations of wolves.
Yeah.
But let's talk about how important wolves are to our ecosystem and to being a top predator.
So the wolf is actually what we call a keystone species. And that means if you have a keystone species present within a system, an ecosystem, it's usually a good indicator that that system's going to be balanced, healthy, support biodiversity. And in the wolf's case, it's a top predator, and it will have a trickle-down effect on other living things in the habitat or in the ecosystem. So specifically, one of the most famous effects wolves have had, places like Yellowstone National Park, is they will control populations of herding ungulates, so deer, elk, moose. And by controlling those populations and also influencing the way those animals behave, the way they forage for food, it protects habitat, which then can be safeguarded for other living things as well.
The undergrowth of forests.
Exactly, something that we don't have here in the Northeast.
But, I read a story in the Times the other day. In Staten Island in 2008, they thought they had 24 deer, and now they think they have 800 and something. And that's in Staten Island, where you usually think of as a wild community.
They actually have a lot of good space there. And I believe Staten Island is one of the only places the coyote has not come back. So perhaps if the coyote were able to get on that ferry across the bridge.
Well, tell us about Atka.
So Atka is a gray wolf. Specifically, he's a subspecies called the Arctic gray wolf. And actually, hold on a second. Atka. He looks really warm. Okay. And so there are different kinds of wolf or subspecies, 5 of them recognized in North America. And as you can see, he's such a gentleman.
He is. Yeah.
Yes, he's hardly spilling at all.
He spills less than me.
And so the Arctic gray wolf, as the name suggests, is the type of wolf that would occupy the most northern part of gray wolf range in North America. So they're living in the high Arctic, close to the North Pole. There's a population.
Alaska above.
Yeah, there's a population in Greenland, actually. So everything about the way Atka looks, he looks that way because he's really, he's got a long tongue.
Really, that's amazing.
He's shaped by the pressures of nature to survive in that sort of habitat. So very cold weather, really living on snow and ice or frozen ground all the time. And so he's adapted.
Is that why his paws are so big?
Exactly. Oh, there he goes.
I don't know if you can see it in the TV shot, but he has, as someone said to me before we started taping here today, a wolf is not a dog. And this is not a dog. I mean, the paws are tremendous.
Yeah, his paws, those are actually, they're big, and they provide, because it has extra surface area, they work like snowshoes.
Okay.
So wolves are really well adapted to traveling and surviving in the snow. And the animals they're hunting, for the Arctic wolf, it would be animals like the musk ox or caribou or the Arctic hare. they're going to have a much better time on the snow than some of those larger animals.
They won't break through.
Yeah, those larger animals they're eating, vegetation. So
Right.
they're going to be growing increasingly weaker and weaker as winter progresses. So wolves will have an advantage getting through the snow, but also the fact that they're going to be a bit stronger, not having to rely on plants in order to survive.
Let me ask something, Maggie. Wolves are covered under the Endangered Species Act?
It's a little bit complicated.
Because I know there's been some controversy out west, right?
So essentially, wolves lived here in North America for thousands of years. Scientists believe that we had at least 250,000 wolves living in the lower 48 states for quite some time.
Wow.
And then, of course, through European settlement hundreds of years ago, we started killing wolves. And we really had a campaign in our country to get rid of most of the large predators. And we were very good. And by the time I guess mid last century, we pretty much eradicated wolves here in the lower 48.
Wow.
So there was a small population that remained in Minnesota.
Northwoods
And maybe one or two that kind of straddled the border between Montana and Canada. But it was in 1973 that that the Endangered Species Act was passed. And then wolves were shortly after listed as protected under the Endangered Species Act. And since that time, wolves in the Great Lakes in Minnesota were allowed to naturally recover, and they're in Wisconsin now, and Michigan.
Yellowstone.
They were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park.
So just when those other areas, Wisconsin and Michigan, that was a natural growth?
That was recolonization, and there were some smaller reintroduction.
As a result of the Endangered Species Act?
Yes, but it's basically recolonization, so them just kind of recovering naturally. And there was some little nuances. In order to get to certain areas, they, for a few decades, I believe, stopped the coyote hunts during deer season to allow wolves to more easily recolonize to areas where they weren't present. But then we did reintroduce them. So there were acts where actually the federal government took wolves and put them on the wild landscape. And that's what happened almost 20 years ago in Yellowstone and central Idaho. And now they're in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. There's a population in Oregon and Washington. One wolf in California.
All reintroduced.
Spurred. Some of them spurred from that reintroduction. So that was where they originated, but they're the offspring of, and some of them probably came down from Canada as well. And then there's another kind of wolf, the Mexican gray wolf, which is critically endangered. That was reintroduced almost 17 years ago into Arizona and New Mexico.
And how's that population doing?
It's been a fragile population for pretty much since the get-go. At the end of year or last year end of year count, there were 83 of them, which is the highest number there's ever been.
Okay.
So in terms of their protections today, wolves in Montana and Idaho actually were removed from the endangered species list in 2011. And unfortunately, it was unprecedented because it didn't go through the natural avenue of way of delisting or a species. It was actually an intervention by Congress. And the delisting occurred via
the results of ranchers?
A rider on a budget bill. It was a political thing.
You got to read those riders.
Yeah, and it was it was one of those must-pass budget bills where the government's going to shut down. Wyoming then followed suit the next year, and then wolves were also removed in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, not through any sort of amendment.
Does that mean they're allowed to hunt them now?
Yeah, so unfortunately, in 5 of the 6 states where those protections were removed in just the past couple of years, that same year that they were removed from the endangered species list, they had public hunts. So I can't think of any other animal where they're on the endangered species list,
and they're right.
And then they're a game species.
Now, is that because it's a trophy animal, or is it because the perceived fear of ranchers that there'll be like you've seen on cartoons that the wolf will be coming and eating all my sheep?
I think it's a combination of things, and I think there is perceived fears or threats that that are associated with wolves, but I think a lot of it's political. And it's unfortunate because there's really no reason to have these public hunts. Most of the reasoning behind public hunts would be one, human safety, but there really hasn't been a case where we've seen wolves pose any sort of real threat to people. And the other one would be livestock conflict. So depredation of livestock.
But isn't there even that argument? Isn't there even like some sort of program that if a wolf kills, I don't know, your sheep or your cow, somebody will reimburse you the price of the animal?
There have been programs like that, yeah, compensation programs.
Yeah.
And for a while they were run by Defenders of Wildlife. Now there are actually state programs to do it. But even having a public hunt to control that sort of conflict isn't the solution either, because you're not necessarily killing the animals responsible
Right.
For the crime. And we actually do have, it's actually a branch of the USDA called Wildlife Services that goes in and does take care of these animals that are the cause of the conflict. And one of the problems is if you're just going in and having these public hunts, you're really disrupting these social entities, these families. And when you're doing that, you could actually create more problem wolves because they're not having the family
Right.
traditions and the upbringing.
Because they hunt as a pack.
Yeah, and so you might have these young wolves then without the really the role models of how to be a successful wolf in a successful family, and it could cause more depredation on our farm animals.
I want to ask you about the social structure of wolves, but I just want to point out to the audience, if you see the wolf walking around the studio, that's because, as I was informed by Rebecca, the handler, wolves aren't dogs, and wolves go where wolves want to go. So
You just laid down.
This is you just laid as if to prove me wrong. I could just lay down. Thank you, Ed. Let me just ask you about the social structure. I know they hunt in packs and they live in packs. So can you just explain the social structure of?
Sure. It's very similar to our families. Basically, a pack is just a family unit of wolves. In fact, there have been some scientists that have been using the words family instead of pack, just to really so people understand what these animals are. And so it's going to be comprised of mom and dad, usually the pups of whatever year that is, and maybe a few older wolves. It might have been pups from the previous year, what have you. Sometimes an aunt or uncle. Every family is different, the same way it is
Now,
for us.
A male wolf, he's a year, 2 years old. Does he go out on his own, or does he stay in the pack?
Often wolves, both male and female, will disperse from the family when they're about 2, 3, 4 years old in order to create their own pack, maybe join an existing pack, which is a little bit harder to do. But yeah, so often they're going to disperse. I think it's more likely the male, but females do it too. And the most remarkable thing is once they do leave that family territory, they tend to keep on traveling until they find that mate. And because of that, we've seen these epic treks that some of these wolves make. One was very recent, this past couple of years. It's a wolf from Oregon named OR7. And it's just it's the 7th wolf in
Right.
Oregon. But it had a GPS collar, so we're able to really know where this wolf was. And it went actually into California.
Wow.
A few times, and actually really paved the road to getting California to list the gray wolf as an endangered species on the state level, which is really cool. This
is really
wolf
cool.
proved that, hey, I can do it, others
and
can
there hadn't
too.
been wolves in California?
Not in about 80 years.
Wow.
More even recently.
What species will do for love.
I know, exactly. And this is just like breaking news from last month. A wolf, well, it was an animal, they didn't know what it was sighted on the northern rim of the Grand Canyon. And
Okay.
it had some sort of collar. It did not look like a Mexican gray wolf, which is on the other side of the Grand Canyon, and more south. But it did look very wolf-like. It does get confusing because people do have wolf-dog hybrids, and sometimes they're set loose and what have you. But they were able, through its scat, which is its poop, do a DNA analysis and verify that it is a gray wolf from the Northern Rockies region.
Wow.
And it's a female and traveled, I don't know, 700 miles or something down to the Grand
Wow.
Canyon, again, looking for
How
love.
cool is that?
So it's really neat to have these animals, and this was a collar that didn't even work, so they didn't,
They
didn't
weren't
know.
tracking it anymore.
Yeah,
Right.
so it's really interesting to see, first of all, what these animals could prove, that they can cross highways, they can get through towns, they can get through, areas where people want to hunt wolves.
Well, they're amazingly smart animals.
They
right?
are,
Yeah.
and just resilient, and to prove those wild ways, those corridors, they do exist, which is it's uplifting.